One problem plagues video games more than any other medium. Between spin-offs, sequels, prequels, generation gaps, remakes, and remasters, it can be confusing to jump into a new series when there are that many entries. For some, it's as easy as starting with the earliest release, but for others, it's not so simple. Welcome to Where to Start, a series where I'll be delving into some of the more complex video game series, and tell you where you should start, what entries you should skip, and how much time you'll be expecting to put into any new series. For our debut episode, and in commemoration of Yakuza 6's English release, I'll be talking to you about all the different entries in the franchise, what I would consider mandatory viewing, and the quickest way to catch up for the newest release. If this is your first exposure to the Yakuza series, then I welcome you. You're in for one hell of a journey. Now, let's begin. Yakuza is a series of 3D beat-em-ups by Sega Japan. The series is distinctly Japanese, taking place in a variety of Japanese locales, from the bustling cities of Tokyo and Dotonbori to the relaxing beaches of Okinawa. Stories typically revolve around the dealings of the Yakuza, a criminal group deeply entrenched in Japanese society. Players typically take control of Kazuma Kiryu, the Dragon of Dojima, a legendary Yakuza member who always finds himself in the thick of conspiracies and family takeovers. As the series goes on, more playable characters are added to the mix, from a Japanese detective to a loan shark with a heart of gold, and even an ex-baseball player. More likely though, you'll know it as the game where things like this happen. I hesitate to call it the Assassin's Creed of Japan, considering it has a generally higher quality than Ubisoft's open world games, but it has the oversaturation of one. Yakuza has been an annualized series in Japan from the beginning, with at least one mainline entry or spin-off coming out every year in Japan. That number has now gone up to at least one game every 6 months, meaning us in the West have been a little bit left behind when it comes to localizations. When it comes to Japan, Yakuza has hit a whopping 15 entries, not even counting games that are announced and not out yet like Shin Yakuza, or re-releases such as the 1 and 2 HD collection. Out of those 15, 8 of those are currently out and fully localized in the West, not counting both Yakuza 6 and Kiwami 2, which will bring us up to 10 games by the end of this year. For this video, we'll be focusing on games that are already localized. However, I'll do another video at some point talking about the games that will probably never be localized, and let you know what's worth crossing the language barrier to play. With 8 games spanning 3 consoles and some remakes thrown into the mix, I'm not surprised people despair just looking at the list. Never mind thinking of catching up. Let's take this step by step and break down exactly what this list involves. If you have very little exposure to the Yakuza series, then you might be wondering why the number of games that have been localized is very low. There are a number of reasons for that, but the main reason is quite simple. Up until very recently, Yakuza was not a very popular series. When it comes to the early entries, the games were notorious flops in the West. The first game came out in Japan in 2005, and would take around 9 months to be localized. Since Yakuza had done so well in Japan, Sega of America wanted to ensure that the game would do just as well in the West. This involved hiring voice talent for the game that included Mark Hamill and Bill Farmer, the voice of Goofy. Yes, I am deadly serious.
Hey, Batman!
Gosh, where are we?
However, even with talent like this, the dub suffered from awful direction, some other mediocre voice actors, and was notoriously bad.
Go! Kill this arrogant motherfucker!
When Yakuza 2 came out in Japan in 2006, it would take almost 2 years to localize it. This time, they gave up on giving the game a dub and just kept the original voice acting with English subtitles. However, the damage seemed to be done, as Yakuza 2 only sold around 40,000 copies in America compared to a whopping 830,000 in Japan. Yakuza 2 was the third best-selling game in Japan in 2006, solidifying itself as a new force to be reckoned with, but it wouldn't catch its footing in the West for a long time. After 2, the localizations for the series get pretty dire. The next game, Yakuza Kenzan, never made it to the West, followed by Yakuza 3 receiving a localization with tons of cut content, from hostess bars to almost a quarter of the side quests. Yakuza 4 would come out a year after its Japanese release, and be mostly unchanged, although that couldn't stop it from having fairly mediocre sales.
Hookers, murderers, hostess hangouts, fetish clubs, $5 sake, you get my drift. And these guys here, these guys are nasty, bad people. You're looking at 4 of the most brutal and committed individuals ever to grace Tokyo's infamous underworld, the Yakuza.
After 4, we really begin to see the effects of the low sales numbers, as Japan would receive 2 PSP spin-offs, a PS3 spin-off, and fancy new HD versions of 1 and 2 on the PS3. Out of these 4, the West would only ever see Dead Souls. Yakuza 5 would suffer the most of any new entry, and is where we really see the West fall behind. Not only did the game take 3 years to come to the West, it was also only sold digitally, with no physical edition. In those 3 years, Japan got Ishin and Zero, and the West would be officially playing catch-up from this point on. By the time Zero came out in the West, both a remake of the first game and the 6th mainline entry would come out. Since Zero, we've been getting a steady stream of Yakuza games in the West, releasing one almost every 6 months. Zero has been a turning point in the West when it comes to Yakuza's popularity. It was nominated for a number of awards, and considering stores had difficulty keeping stock of the game, demand was higher than Sega expected. After 6 games, Yakuza had finally gotten its footing in the West. And with Zero being a prequel, it's honestly the perfect game to get people interested in the series. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's take a step back and put all of this into context. Yakuza is a strictly PlayStation franchise, and spreads across over 10 years of entries. This means in order to play all of the entries, you'll at the very least need a PS2, PS3, and PS4. However, due to low sales of each entry, getting your hands on some of the earlier games is not only difficult enough, but will also cost you a pretty penny. While not extortionate, Yakuza 2 in particular goes for somewhere between 40 and 50 in both PAL and NTSC regions. Some of the other entries aren't particularly expensive, mainly due to Sega's extremely clever variable pricing. With the release of Kiwami, the game is sold for a price of €30. Despite this budget price, the game is not a budget entry, but it makes the sting of buying a Yakuza game every 6 months a lot easier to swallow. This is on top of Yakuza 0 receiving price drops and being quite cheap now. As for the PS3 generation games, 4, 5, and Dead Souls are available digitally, meaning 3 is the only entry you'll have to go out of your way to get physically. So, getting a full collection of Yakuza games for your shelf may be a bit of an expensive journey, but considering the majority of recent entries go for reasonable prices, or can be bought digitally cheap enough, playing every entry is a relatively small money investment, although it is coupled by a pretty major time investment. There's a definite curve when it comes to time investment in this franchise. As the series goes on, the games become more and more ambitious, with tons more side quests and things to do outside the main quest. Yakuza might have one of the biggest gaps between its main story expected finish time to its completionist time. Here's the list of bare minimum times you'll be expected to play the games for to beat them. As you can see, 0 and 5 are the only real outliers, with most of them hovering around the 15 to 20 hour mark. The total amount of time is quite high, but for 8 different games altogether, it's not too crazy. However, if you want the full experience for the series, you'll probably be spending a bit more time with them than this. Yakuza is a franchise that prides itself on the fluff around the main story. Between the wacky side quests or just hitting up the karaoke bar with a hostess, you can spend hours upon hours in these games. This is where we get to the crazy numbers. If you're the kind of person who needs to do everything in a game, then Yakuza is both your best friend and your worst nightmare. The combined total of completionist times for the 8 games right now sits at around 594 hours. Once again, you can see a clear increase in the amount of time as the series goes on, mostly due to Yakuza 4 and 5 introducing multiple characters, all with their own upgrades to grind for and areas to explore, and side quests to do. While I think the completionist times are a bit much, I do think you should add a little bit to the minimum time to account for doing some of the side stuff. So, now that you know exactly what you're in for, let's finally get into the elusive question: where should I start? For this section of the video, I'll be implementing a traffic light system. It's quite simple really. I'll be rating each game individually on their level of beginner friendliness. The 3 levels are green being a perfect place to start, amber being good but not great, and red being a bad place to start. So without further ado, let's get into it. For green games, we've got Yakuza 1, Yakuza Kiwami, and Yakuza 0. While Yakuza 1 is kind of clunky, if you can get your hands on it, it's a perfectly fine place to start. Starting from the beginning is always advised wherever possible, especially since you get to see exactly how the games developed and found their feet. The only disadvantages are the availability of the game, and of course, the dub.
Just your bad luck to run into me.
It's Haruka. That's my name.
Yakuza Kiwami is a remake of 1, so it only makes sense that it's also a decent place to start. It actually fixes a lot of the small issues with the original, and offers people who may not be able to handle the look of PS2 games a way to experience the beginning of the franchise. The only disadvantage is that after playing Kiwami, it might be hard for some people to go back and play entries like Yakuza 3, which are much stiffer and less varied in comparison. Yakuza 0 is the final green score. Not only is it the earliest game in the franchise timeline, it's also one of the better entries, meaning if you start with this one and decide it's not for you, then more than likely the rest of the games aren't going to convince you. The game doesn't expect you to know what happened in the rest of the series, and does a pretty good job of characterizing the protagonists for new players. The only disadvantage I can see is missing out on the nostalgia of seeing older characters return in their younger forms, but that's not the end of the world. For the Amber rank, we've only got one entry, Yakuza 2. While Yakuza 2 is a sequel, it doesn't really relate to the first entry too much, meaning jumping in at the second game won't be too confusing, although a couple names might go over your head. While it's not perfect, if you can somehow get your hands on a copy of 2 but not 1, then it's a decent place to start. Finally, that leaves us with a red score for everything else. Yakuza 3, 4, 5, and Dead Souls. Yakuza 3 gets this rank for a number of reasons, the main one being that it's the most butchered of all the entries. If you go into 3 expecting the side quests and time killers that people talk about in this series so much, then you'll be greatly disappointed. On a more personal level, I believe this entry is the weakest overall from both a story and gameplay perspective, so I don't think it acts as a very good primer for the series. Yakuza 4 is an interesting one because it's a turning point for the franchise when they introduce multiple protagonists, and it is a very enjoyable entry, but there's a couple of things that stop it from being a perfect jumping in point. For one, the story is almost as much a sequel to the first game as it is to 3, meaning you may spend a lot of the final section of the game confused unless you've read up on the rest of the story. It also has some weird characterization of older characters, meaning you may get a very wrong impression of some people if you start here. Yakuza 5's biggest issue is how overbearing it is. Not only do you have 5 playable characters this time, but you've also got a lot of extended cast to remember and learn. This isn't too much of a problem for people who have played the previous entries, but when you're trying to learn who the old cast are on top of the slew of other characters, you may find yourself being overwhelmed. On a similar note, this game is the end of multiple character arcs established over the series, so you'll be pretty much jumping in at the end of a lot of these stories, so be warned. Finally, Dead Souls. I mean, do I have to explain this one? So now that we're all on the same page, let's get down to business. The recommended route. It's all good starting somewhere, but where do you go next? I've devised 3 routes depending on what you want out of the series, or how much time you have. The first route is very simple, play in release order. If you're the kind of person who doesn't like to skip entries or has the time to go through the entirety of the series, then this is for you. I highly recommend this route, assuming you can get your hands on a copy of each game. If you're the kind of person who either doesn't own a PS2 anymore, or just can't get into games that are older than the 360 PS3 generation, then Route 2 is for you. However, it does involve a bit of a wait. By the time you finish Yakuza 0 and Kiwami, Kiwami 2 should be either out or just around the corner. After that, continue the series as normal. The final route is assuming you only own a PS4, which would have been a very short list up until recently. However, if you live in the States, you're in luck. If you're willing to give PlayStation Now a shot and don't mind sticking to all digital, then the only games unavailable to you are 3 and Dead Souls. Like I said earlier, with 3 being the weakest entry, if you really can't access a PS3, then these 2 aren't too big of a deal. Finally, we've got one more category. Someone puts a gun to my head and says to recommend only one Yakuza game above all the others. If you don't have the time or the money to play this massive series and will only play one, then this section is for you. For this series, I am honestly a little torn, but going with the safest bet, I'll give it to Yakuza 0. There are several reasons for this, between the story, which doesn't expect you to know who these characters are, the amazing setting, the varied gameplay, and most importantly, the most value for money. If you were to play one Yakuza game for as long as possible, according to how long to beat, you can't go wrong with 0. It also means that if you beat it and fall in love with the series, then it's a perfect in for the rest of the games. I will say that this answer might change in August when Kiwami 2 comes out, since I do consider 2 as the best entry story-wise, so we'll see what happens when I finally get my hands on that. But for now, 0 will do. If you decide to follow my recommended route, then you've got a lot of games ahead of you. So I've devised a couple of tips that will help you avoid the ever-threatening feeling of burnout. Like with any series this long, try to avoid marathoning it. I know myself that getting really into a series can make you want to get through it as quickly as possible, but I guarantee you'll enjoy Yakuza more if you take a bit of time between games. Especially with the earlier entries, the combat can feel a little bit samey, so playing something else before jumping straight into the next game can help mitigate this. Don't forget to stop and smell the roses while playing these games. While the main story is almost always extremely compelling, a lot of the fun comes from the side quests and mini-games that populate Kamurocho. I'm not saying to spend 50 plus hours on each game, although you could if you really wanted to, but don't be so eager to rush to the next game either. A general tip for the franchise, but if the game asks you if you're sure you're ready before going to the next part of the story, then you should always go to the nearest pharmacy and buy healing items. That may seem very obvious, but the series does this a lot, and it can get extremely frustrating if you're stuck in a dungeon without any healing items. Don't worry too much about grinding for experience. While the games do have RPG style level ups, outside of 1 or 2 boss fights in each game, the difficulty never becomes an issue. My final tip only counts for you if you're starting with the original Yakuza. Don't take the English dub as a sign of the game's quality. It's very easy to listen to it and write the game off, but if you take it for what it is, a hilariously bad effort, then you can gain a certain appreciation for it. Most importantly though, it's only there for one game, so if you can't stand it, at least know it's not going to be around for very long. Really, Yakuza is one of those rare series that has a consistently high quality. Even the weakest entries are still 7s or 8s, and none of them are outright terrible. You could technically jump in at any entry and enjoy it to a certain extent, but while Yakuza is most known for its wacky fun and crazy gameplay, it really is a series that tries to tell a very in-depth and complex story. People joke about Metal Gear, but some of these entries hit MGS levels of cutscenes. So whatever you decide to do, I just hope that you enjoy these games nearly as much as I do. Playing them from start to finish over the last year or so has been a trip to say the least, but it's been extremely enjoyable, and I can't wait to play Yakuza 6 as soon as I'm done uploading this video. So, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go pick up my pre-order. Thank you so much for watching till the end of the video, I really appreciate it. The video's been a long time coming, mainly because I've been playing Yakuza games for the last year, pretty much non-stop. So I've been catching up slowly, and then this is pretty much where I wanted to end up. If you're a fan of Yakuza and you're watching this video, then maybe consider sending it to a friend if you want to get them involved. Just to let them know what they're in for, you know, all the crazy stuff. If you're new to Yakuza, then thanks for watching the video as well. I hope I managed to convince you to jump into the series, no matter what game you play. Really, this video is just a guide on how I think you should play the series, but to be honest, like I said in the video, you can jump into any entry and have a lot of fun, so this isn't like a rule to life or anything. So that's that. This video took a lot of time to edit and I'm just finished, so thank God I can stop thinking about Yakuza for a few minutes until I start playing 6. But yeah, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I'm at cicada_wave. If you want to follow me here on YouTube, I'd really appreciate it. Subscribe and check out my videos whenever I put them up. That's how small channels like this grow. If you want to follow me on Twitch, I'm streaming there usually every week. I'm either Mondays or Wednesdays. I'm at twitch.tv/cicadawave, no underscore. And right now I'm going through Dark Souls very slowly with a plastic guitar. So that's pretty fun. So yeah, thanks again for watching. Send this to a friend if you would like, and I will see you when I see you. Thanks guys.